Hello there. Today I wanted to take a look at a wine that is a classic and historic style of wine coming from the Auckland region. And this is the second of two wines I'm looking at from Fino Valley Wines. And this is their classic rich port. It's a non-vintage wine. And I probably should say it's quite traditional to find this being sold in those wineries that still make this sort of style of wine in a 1.5 litre flagon. So you're probably already asking, how come producers in New Zealand, even in their own domestic market, are getting away with calling this a port when port is a geographical indication within the European Union and therefore should only be a description that you can use when you're talking about wines that come from the Douro Valley? And the answer really is that unlike, say, Australia, there haven't yet been legal bans instituted as a result of agreements with the EU. The use of the term is regarded as a long-standing traditional term. It's been used by wineries in this region for this style of wine for over 100 years. And it's been judged to have become a generic term for this style of locally produced fortified wine. However, the phasing out of the term is scheduled to begin soon. Now, New Zealanders were traditionally very influenced by British tastes, and I guess in the 50s and the 60s, the British had a liking for ports and sherries. So local producers in and around Auckland and perhaps up in Northland as well made wines in the style of port and sherry to satisfy consumer demand and simply labelled them under those names. Evidently, the use of the term port wasn't considered to be misleading and deceptive, as the term champagne had believed to be, which is why New Zealand producers can't call their bottle fermented sparkling wines champagne, even in the New Zealand market. Now, the European Union protects trade names with geographical indications. So we see with the recently signed European Union-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement that there was a clause in that agreement to phase out the use of names with geographical indications. So port and sherry came into that. Evidently feta also comes into that. And this free trade agreement was signed in July of 2023, taking effect on the 1st of May in 2024. So in effect, one of the clauses of this agreement signed away the use of these terms by New Zealand wine producers, and I'm sure there were many other clauses as well, but these were signed away in exchange for better access for New Zealand products to the European Union's markets. There is a transition period, and that varies from between 5 to 9 years from 2022. So the use of terms like port and sherry should be entirely phased out by 2031, if not before. At which stage the term port will actually become exclusively for the use of producers fortified wines from the Douro Valley. Just briefly to talk about Fino Valley Wines. The winery was established in 1966 by Ivan and Milka Tvrdeich, who had emigrated to New Zealand from their native Croatia with their 3 sons back in 1951. And the family already had a history of winemaking in Croatia. And the family purchased a 4-hectare parcel of land in the Henderson Valley to the west of Auckland, in what was at the time rural land. They relocated an old house onto the property, and that original homestead still stands there next to the winery. Now, before they actually planted their vineyard and developed the winery, they first used the land for dairy farming and then for growing various fruit. I believe they grew strawberries and then had a peach orchard. But eventually, Ivan decided that they should plant some grapevines, that being something he was familiar with from his native Croatia. Most of the initial planting was done by Ivan and Milka's 3 sons, Ivan Jr., Zachary and Nick. And evidently money was short, so they did things like, for instance, to create the trellising, they had to make their own homemade concrete posts, and they used stakes that they'd hewn from trees in the local forest. And the grapes that they planted in the 1960s and the early 70s started out including hybrid varieties and muscats. And initially the wines they first made were ports and sherries, and that's a tradition that they've continued. But the 1970s saw a boom in table wine consumption in New Zealand, and so the family planted Riesling, Chenin Blanc and Chardonnay to capitalise on that demand. Now, Ivan Sr. passed away in 2007, and since then the business has been run by his children, And I believe there is a next generation of the family becoming involved as well. Now today, Fino Valley's 4-hectare home block in the Henderson Valley is planted with varieties such as Malbec, Chambourcin, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc. Of course, we have the Diamond White that I looked at recently, and there are still Muscat varieties planted there. And particularly the Diamond White and the Muscat evidently are trellised on a high overhead trellis, which I assume is a trellising method that Ivan had brought with him from Croatia. Today, the winery and the vineyard are bordered by suburban housing, as this particular end of the Henderson Valley is sort of on the rural-urban fringe of an expanding Auckland. The winery has the capacity to produce about 250,000 litres of wine a year. And given its now suburban setting, they believe the vineyard may be some of New Zealand's most expensive vineyard land. Today they produce and sell mostly Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir from Marlborough, and also red Bordeaux blends produced from their vineyards in Hawke's Bay. But fruit grown both in Marlborough and in Hawke's Bay is transported up to the winery in Auckland for processing. Now the details I have for this particular wine is the fruit is completely hand harvested, it's entirely destemmed, crushed and put into stainless steel tanks for fermentation. Fermentation is conducted entirely with indigenous yeasts, and that fermentation is arrested partway through by the addition of brandy to halt fermentation and to capture the sweetness in the wine. And the fermentation is stopped, leaving about 100 grams per litre of sugar in the wine. Now, the blend for the port is very complex and seems to involve a sort of Solera system that combines both varieties, vintages, uses a number of different types of oak for aging. And then also, of course, there's the brandy that's added for fortification. And another complexity is that apparently this is a wine that's an interregional blend. So I'm told the varieties that go into the wine are principally Malbec, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. However, there are quite a number of other varieties to the extent that they haven't listed them. And I'm told there are up to 15 different vintages of wine in this. So not only is it a complex blend of different grape varieties and also oak types, but actually each vintage is adding an additional layer of complexity to the wine. Now, aging goes on in seasoned barrels, and they say these are French, American and Scottish. Now, I'm not aware of people actually using Scottish grown oak, so my assumption is that the types of oak are French and American, and some of that oak has previously been used for the aging of Scotch whisky. My reasoning that this is an interregional blend is the fact that the back label simply says that this is made from New Zealand grown grapes. So I would assume that certainly it's a combination at least of fruit from Henderson and Hawke's Bay, and possibly even from Marlborough. And the other point that was made to me that is quite interesting is that the wine only has 13.9% alcohol to suit the demands of supermarkets for them to sell it. However, the lower strength means that the maximum amount of time that it's suitable to spend aging in oak is about 3 years. So if it's correct that you've got 15 different vintages in there, I can only assume that the wines are taken out of oak and combined with the other vintages in tank subsequently. Having said all that about the way this wine is produced, the other thing I should mention is that it's an exceptionally cheap wine. I paid 10 New Zealand dollars for this. I'm struggling to think where else I would find a wine that had been fermented with indigenous yeasts and aged in barrel for 3 years for just $10. So I'm really interested to taste it and see what it delivers. Yet at the same time, for a wine with such an entry-level price tag, my expectations of quality aren't exceptional. So let's stop prejudging it and take a look at the wine. First thing I'd say is that there's really quite a good depth of colour. It's at least a medium to deep ruby red colour. I can just about see through it. It's not the inky black that you get with a top vintage port, certainly, and it's not the vivid purple colour you might expect from a young port. Swirling it, the wine, as I say, it's roughly 14% alcohol, 13.9% on the label, and also with 100 grams per litre of sugar. It's very readily forming tears on the side of the glass there. There are sort of quite noticeable legs running down the side. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are mellow, they're mature, they're ripe, they're very harmonious. There certainly isn't any particular note of spiritiness, there isn't any oak standing out there. What I'm getting is rich, ripe, mature fruit, perhaps a little bit of red plum and perhaps some raisin notes, but then going on to deeper black fruit such as blackberry, boysenberry and black plum. The aromas are of medium intensity, but as I say, they're harmonious. So let's have a taste. First thing I'd say is obviously the wine is sweet. There is a bit of warmth. The wine is medium to full-bodied. There are slight notes of coffee, perhaps a chocolatey smoothness on the palate. There is a nice, rich raisin intensity. Moving on into richer red fruit notes of boysenberry and dark plum. There is perhaps a slight dusty smoky note that might indicate the wine spent a bit of time in oak, but that doesn't particularly stand out. There's actually some quite nice freshness that's helping me salivate. And there I'm seeing some sort of black plum to prune fruit coming through and giving richness to the mid-palate. The wine has a reasonable length, it's nicely balanced, the acidity is sufficient to leave the finish quite clean. The alcohol at about 14% is sufficient to add to the warmth, richness and roundness of the wine, but doesn't make it hot and heavy. The wine is harmonious and has a nice maturity. There is a relatively simple, sweet, black plum to prune finish, but that's actually really rather attractive. And I have to come back again to the price point of this, which I purchased from the winery for $10. To get a wine of this quality at this price is impressive, and to be honest, perhaps a little unexpected. I'm certainly not trying to make an argument that this is a wine that would rival a good vintage port. However, I do think it's a wine that's probably got more balance and harmony than a lot of what would be more expensive, certainly in the New Zealand market, entry-level ruby ports from Portugal. I think it's a wine that shows a winery with a long experience of making these styles of wine and making them well. And I'm sure, given the quality of the wine, it doesn't really need to use the name port in order to sell. Now, normally I would leave a link to the Wine Searcher webpage for this wine so that you could check up on the pricing. I'm afraid this wine isn't currently listed on Wine Searcher, but I will leave a link to the details page for Fino Valley Wines, and you will be able to follow that to see what of their wines are available. As a result, I also don't have a Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine. Personally, I'm impressed by it. I wouldn't suggest that it's a fine wine that I'm going to put down in my cellar for years, but possibly I will go back and buy a few bottles just to have, because it's an enjoyable drink. To score this wine, I would give this 88 points out of 100. I think it's a soundly made wine, offering really good value for money in what is these days perhaps not a particularly popular style. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you found the video of interest. If you have, it would be absolutely fantastic if you could press the like button for us. Also, if you're watching these videos and you're enjoying them, could I ask you please, could you consider subscribing, because it would be great to have your support. And the growing number of followers will help me to develop the channel further. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. That would be a wonderful endorsement coming from you. I'd really appreciate that. And if you have any comments or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. So thank you once again for taking the trouble to join me, and I do hope that maybe you might be able to find some time, come and join me again for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.